Hey everyone, and welcome. Today in this explainer, we are embarking on a really fascinating journey through time. We're going to be exploring Firas Sawa's incredible book, The History of Jerusalem. Specifically, we'll be looking at how Sawa systematically contrasts the traditional, well-known history of ancient Jerusalem with the hard realities of modern archaeology. Basically, we're comparing what was written in ancient texts with what has actually been dug out of the ground. Get ready, because what the Earth reveals is a completely different story than what many of us are used to hearing. Okay, let's dive into this. For centuries, the accepted story has been way back in the 10th century BCE, there was this massive, glorious, united kingdom ruled by David and Solomon. According to the texts, this was a sprawling empire stretching all the way from the Euphrates River down to the borders of Egypt. It was wealthy, powerful, and culturally dominant. But here is the central mystery that Safa's work highlights. Where is the physical proof? Because when modern archaeologists actually started digging using rigorous scientific methods, they fully expected to find the remnants of this vast empire. But the Earth? Well, the Earth had a very different story to tell. Here is our roadmap for today's explainer. 1. The search for an empire. 2. The 10th century void. 3. The true first kingdom, Samaria. 4. The late rise of Judah. And 5. Inventing the narrative.
All right, let's start with part 1, the search for an empire.
For a really long time, excavations in this region were driven by a literal reading of ancient texts. People were desperately hoping to find Solomon's golden age. But impartially speaking, when you look at the data, we are left with a massive contradiction. The texts describe a grand, unified kingdom with immense wealth, huge building projects, and a highly organized central state structure. Yet the physical archaeological reality from the 10th century BCE shows only a landscape dotted with isolated, small tribal villages. There's simply no trace of essential authority, no grand monuments, and honestly, no infrastructure capable of supporting a vast state. Which brings us right into part 2, the 10th century void. So, if the Grand Empire wasn't there, what actually was? To answer that, we have to turn to one of the most highly respected figures in modern archaeology, the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon. During her rigorous excavations in the 1960s, she established a truly groundbreaking timeline. Her ultimate conclusion was that 10th century Jerusalem, the supposed beating heart of Solomon's magnificent empire, was, in reality, nothing more than a small, unfortified village. Think about that for a second. Early archaeologists went out hoping to find gleaming palaces, but what they actually dug up were dirt floors and small settlements. There were no grand imperial structures, no massive walls, and definitely no sprawling palaces during the supposed Golden Age. And this reality extends well beyond Jerusalem, too. For years, massive building projects and gate structures in other cities like Megiddo and Hazor were proudly attributed to King Solomon by earlier archaeologists. They even called them Solomonic steebles. But here's the catch. Precise modern dating methods have proven these structures actually belong to a later era entirely. The grand architecture simply doesn't exist in the 10th century BCE. The consensus among modern experts today is totally clear. As the renowned archaeologist Israel Finkelstein notes, we literally cannot speak of a state without a population and without a capital. The void of the 10th century isn't just an anomaly, and it's not a case of archaeologists simply not digging deep enough. It is an established fact. There was absolutely no demographic base or urban center capable of sustaining an empire at that time. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is we hit part 3, the true first kingdom, Samaria. Before we get into the specifics, let's completely restructure our mental timeline of the ancient Middle East. It's like a giant puzzle, and we need to put the pieces in the right order. In the 10th century BCE, we just have those isolated tribal villages we talked about. Moving forward to the 9th century BCE, that's when we see the rise of the first real organized state, the kingdom of Samaria under King Amri. Then, in the 8th century BCE, Samaria falls, and that actually catalyzes the rise of Judah. Finally, much later, in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, the grand textual narrative that we all know is actually written down. So, zeroing in on that 9th century BCE mark, we meet the kingdom of Samaria, which is sometimes referred to historically as Israel. Founded by King Omri around 880 BCE, archaeological and historical records confirm that this was the region's first true unified political entity. The key takeaway here? It wasn't Jerusalem, it was Samaria to the north. And Samaria is fascinating. It grew organically from local Canaanite roots rather than arriving through some grand outside invasion. But most importantly, its existence is objectively verified by external contemporary sources. Assyrian records, like the ones from Shalmaneser III, specifically referred to this land as the House of Omri. It was the real deal. It featured a powerful centralized capital, actual military might, and a robust administration. But it only flourished for just under 2 centuries before it was ultimately destroyed by the expanding Assyrian Empire in 721 BCE. Which smoothly transitions us to part 4, the late rise of Judah.
And this brilliantly illustrates how Jerusalem finally became the major player we read about. It actually experienced a massive, unprecedented expansion much later, during the late 8th and into the 7th centuries BCE. This is the exact moment when Jerusalem transforms from an isolated town into a heavily fortified, sprawling central hub with major infrastructure, including the famous Siloam water tunnel.
To put this sudden, massive growth into perspective, 25,000. During the mid-7th century BCE, Jerusalem experienced a huge demographic boom, swelling to an estimated population of 25,000 people. That's when it finally reached the scale of a true regional capital.
But why did this happen so late? Well, the reasons are entirely geopolitical. Jerusalem's expansion was actually triggered by the destruction of its northern neighbor, Samaria, in 721 BCE. Fleeing refugees poured south into Jerusalem. Furthermore, Judah grew wealthy by acting as a cooperative vassal state under the mighty Assyrian Empire. With the destruction of rival cities like Lachish, Jerusalem basically absorbed their lucrative trade routes, transforming into a major commercial and religious center. Its rise was a direct result of the fall of others.
And finally, part 5, inventing the narrative. So here's the million-dollar question. If the Grand United Empire didn't exist in the 10th century, and Jerusalem only became a major power centuries later, why was the glorious story of David and Solomon written in the first place? According to Sawa's analysis, the textual history we are so familiar with was a retrospective creation. It was constructed centuries later, largely during the post-exile Persian and Hellenistic eras, specifically the 5th and 4th centuries BCE. That is a long, long time after the supposed events of the 10th century actually took place. So the crucial point is the motivation behind the text. During the Persian period, right after the Babylonian exile, diverse groups of returnees and locals desperately needed a unifying identity for the newly established Yehud province. Jerusalem's priests and scribes masterfully merged local folklore, ancient memories, and new political ideology to forge a cohesive identity. They essentially created a mythological golden age of a united past to inspire hope, establish a shared origin, and validate their religious and social structure in the present. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought. If the Grand United Kingdom was an ideological creation of later centuries, how does that change our understanding of historical memory? It really shows us that history isn't just about what physically happened in the dirt. It's also about the powerful stories people tell themselves to survive, to unify, and to build a future. I hope this structured look through the archaeological lens has sparked your curiosity and given you a fascinating new perspective on the region. Thanks so much for joining me. Keep learning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.